It's anger, but it's also sorrow. And it's something where they're unwilling to accept how the world is not how they see it.
Am I okay? Was that a censor?
The gremlins are back.
I thought it was bleeping. I didn't say anything inappropriate, I hope.
On this episode of Pod Virginia, there's a lot of utility in providing citizens with an outlet for input. Twitter legend Goad Gatsby.
You've now set yourself up in a position for them to invent what critical race theory is and throw it at you.
From bedazzled cowboy hats to concealed firearms, he explains why General Assembly committee hearings are not as boring as you think.
So you're spending your time putting out fires, they're spending their time setting more fires. You can't do anything because you're up to your neck in fires. Political fires.
We also talk about environmental permitting authority, the availability of police documents, and a $70 million effort to audit the 2020 election. They know that this is complete BS and are also afraid of their voters. All that and a satirical spot from Steve Artley. Fascinating. On this episode of Pod Virginia.
That is when the veil between the other side is the thinnest. So if you want to get through to the supernatural forces, that would be the ideal time.
Support for Pod Virginia comes from the Virginia Poverty Law Center, using advocacy, education, and litigation to dismantle systemic barriers trapping Virginians in poverty, and the League of Conservation Voters Education Fund, building a stronger conservation voter movement to protect the natural environment and improve the quality of life for all Virginians. And Dominion Energy, dedicated to delivering reliable, affordable, clean energy, protecting the environment, serving customers, empowering people, and creating value for shareholders. And from Patreons who are listeners like you.
I'm Michael Pope. I'm Thomas Bowman. And this is Pod Virginia, the podcast that takes you inside Virginia politics. Later in the show, we're going to hear from local Richmond Twitter legend, Goad Gatsby. He's been live tweeting the General Assembly this year, providing a window into the wild world of committee hearings. Michael, you got to do this interview without me for once. And tell me a little about that and how did it go? And, what makes this worth sticking around for?
Well, from a personal standpoint, it was really fun to do an in-person podcast interview because, since this pandemic has been going on, this has been all virtual. And I got to actually sit down in person with Goad Gatsby, who is kind of like a Twitter legend. And he explains sort of his philosophy of tweeting these. So these committee meetings they sound really boring, and most of the time they are. But if you follow his Twitter feed, he makes them come alive in terms of, he tweets about everything from Amanda Chase's gun case to political arsonists and people setting fires to the extent that, you're so busy putting out the fire that you're constantly sort of chasing the fire that's currently happening while your opponents are setting new fires. He sort of came to everybody's radar during the BLM protests, which he live tweeted from the scene. And so now he shows up at all these committee meetings and live tweets them to his many followers on Twitter. And it's a very entertaining Twitter feed as well. So like I said, he takes these kind of snoozer committee meetings and really makes them come alive. And so you'll get a sense of that in the interview.
Yeah, I was first exposed to him on Twitter during those Black Lives Matter protests in Richmond. And he just had fascinating coverage. And I think he got into something with the cops. Did he talk about that at all?
Well, yes, he did. You'll hear all about that in the interview.
Fascinating.
All right, well, let's get to the news. When the Air Pollution Control Board denied a permit for a pipeline compressor station in Chatham, some criticized the ability of a citizen-led board to issue permits. One of those people is Republican Senator Richard Stuart of King George County. Now he has a bill stripping the Air Pollution Control Board of deciding who gets a permit and who doesn't.
You have a board who makes a decision not necessarily due to the science of the facts, as we have seen in the past, and they don't have to explain themselves. So this bill actually opens up the transparency of these decisions, in my opinion.
Now, the Air Pollution Control Board meets in public and it votes in public, although sometimes its members make controversial decisions. Now, Stuart's bill strips the permitting authority from that board as well as the Water Control Board, giving permitting authority for air pollution and water quality to state officials. Former Water Control Board Chairman Shelton Miles says that's a mistake.
The State Water Control Board makes its decisions based upon public record after full public input, public deliberation, which has been included, but also a public vote. All of that happens in transparency, in public. That's not going to happen if this bill is passed.
And this bill is probably going to pass. The Senate has already approved Senator Stuart's bill, and a House committee approved it last week. So it's on its way to the House floor, where it seems very likely to get a welcome reception. Now, Thomas, you may remember a couple weeks ago, we had Mike Town from the League of Conservation Voters on the podcast, and we talked about this particular effort here to strip the permitting authority from the Air Pollution Control Board and the State Water Board. This is going to happen. Like, the Air Pollution Control Board is very likely no longer going to have the ability to approve permits or deny permits. So that thing that happened back in December when the Air Pollution Control Board denied that compressor station permit for Chatham, well, that's probably never going to happen again. And instead, state officials from DEQ or whatever, like, they're going to have the permitting authority.
The vote surprised me. What was it again? You said
on the Senate floor, it was 32-8. So that's a pretty lopsided victory on the Senate floor in favor of Senator Stuart's bill.
Yeah, and the arguments in favor of this as espoused seem quite dubious. There is a lot of utility in providing citizens with an outlet for input. And without this kind of permitting authority being in a citizen-led board, it's really a move backward, I think, in Virginia's style of governance to one that is a lot more centrally planned. And that's interesting. And so it makes me wonder, with 32 senators voting for it, so that's 12 or 13 Democrats, that makes me wonder if they see something that the rest of us don't.
The argument for doing this is that citizens might not have the technical expertise and they might not be the best people to make decisions. And the folks at DEQ are professionals and they do this every day and they've got the technical expertise. And maybe the folks at DEQ are the people who should be deciding who gets a permit and who doesn't get a permit. And so that's the argument in favor of getting rid of all of this. Then on the other hand, you heard Shelton Miles there, the former chairman of the Water Control Board, say, this is a public decision-making process here. Like, these boards meet in public. They deliberate in public. They make their decisions in public. They're accountable to the public. And also, it's worth noting, all of this discussion about stripping the permitting authority came out of this decision from December in Chatham about the Air Pollution Control Board. It's interesting to me, at some point, they said, okay, we're going to strip the Air Pollution Control Board of permitting authority. Hey, while we're at it, let's also strip the Water Board of its power to do permitting. So clearly there is an effort to roll back some of this permitting authority that these citizen-led boards have. And as you heard Mike Town say on our episode a couple of weeks ago, this dates back for many decades. Lots of people have been wanting to strip these citizen-led boards of these permitting authority for a very long time. And it looks to me like Youngkin is about to put his signature on that.
Yeah, this is a fascinating development. And it seems to me like a smarter way to go about doing it would be to increase the requirements to be qualified to serve on the board in the first place so that we don't have anybody serving on it who doesn't understand the permitting process or isn't an expert. Seems like probably a better way to go about it to me.
Well, in another item in the news, Virginia has some of the weakest public disclosure laws in the country for police files. Thomas, you've heard me complain about this many, many times. Documents that are widely available in other states, guess what? They're not available in Virginia. That includes closed cases that have been closed for many years. Those documents are not available. Now, last year, lawmakers approved a new bill that allowed for public access in some closed cases. But now Gil Harrington says that law puts family members of crime victims in the crosshairs.
I'm concerned that free access to information would energize the murder groupies, folks who are titillated by violent acts, particularly against young women.
Now, she's the mother of Morgan Harrington. You may remember that name. Morgan Harrington was murdered in 2010. Now, the mother of Morgan Harrington, who you just heard in that sound clip, she's working with Republican Delegate Rob Bell to roll back the new public documents to prevent salacious material from appearing on like made-for-TV movies. But Megan Rhyne of the Virginia Coalition for Open Government says returning to the old system would harm public access.
Essentially, we're going back to no access again because we learned prior to 2021 that if given the chance to withhold their file, they're going to be withheld.
Now, lawmakers are trying to work out a compromise that would block access to photos and videos for now and send the rest of the bill to the FOIA Council for study next year. Now, Thomas, there's a lot to unpack here, but essentially what's going on is there is a particular documentary maker, like a television network, that did a FOIA request for, photos and videos of one of these particular cases. And the family member doesn't want that to go out. But because of this new law that passed last year, which, by the way, we talked about on this podcast when we had Delegate Chris Hurst on and he explained this bill, because of that law that Chris Hurst introduced and the governor signed, those documents have to be released. That's the new law. And so now there's this effort to block access by rolling back that new public disclosure law and returning Virginia to the dark days of no access to anything. Now, what you heard Megan Rhyne say there is true. I've personally experienced this in my time as a journalist. Law enforcement agencies in Virginia, they've got discretion to either disclose documents or withhold documents. And what you see happen is they employ that discretion 100% of the time to withhold documents. They will never, ever disclose documents. And so you have to force them to disclose documents. And that's what Chris Hurst was trying to do with this bill. Just let's at least give me closed cases, documents and closed cases. But now it looks like, it's possible they're going to roll that back. And, clearly when you've got the family members giving their stories to lawmakers, that's a compelling case. And it was actually Senator Adam Ebbin that brokered this potential compromise that lawmakers are going to talk about this week, where, okay, so let's stop the photos and documents from going to this particular television network. And then while we're doing that, we'll send the rest of the thing to the FOIA Council for an actual discussion. So, Thomas, you probably hear the frustration in my voice because this is a wall that I beat my head against for years and years and years because I just can't get access to police documents. And I come from Florida where you can get any document. And then I moved to Virginia and then you can't get any document. They're all withheld. So it's very frustrating for journalists that we do not have access to public documents that are available in most states.
Yeah, I can only imagine from your perspective. And I'm somebody who tends to err on the side of public disclosure is better. And I can see where the patron is coming from, especially in this specific instance where the victim's family objects. Look, I think we need to take into account what's in the public interest. And sometimes what's in the public interest is understanding the details of a crime, how it happened, not for the purposes of being salacious and titillating, but for the purposes of educating yourself and learning how to defend against what happened should you ever be in a similar situation. So, look, I don't agree with this effort one bit.
I also question this logic of, okay, so just because somebody might use this information in a way that's salacious or titillating, we're going to use that as the logic to withhold the document from ever being released to the public. I mean, that's like saying, what, let's not have a FOIA at all because the New York Post exists, so let's not ever release anything because it might end up on Fox News or, that's bad logic, right? I mean, on the other hand, you have to feel for these families. Like if I was related to one of these crime victims, I, would not like those documents being released. So there is a tension here. I'm not saying there's not a tension. And it's also really important to understand where these families are coming from and really hear them in terms of what they want the lawmakers to do. But I just personally side on public disclosure because I feel like that's very important.
Yeah, and there sounds like there might be another middle ground that isn't being discussed, where public agencies' default option is to provide this data in a FOIA request. However, there could be some room for compromise where the victim's family, especially depending upon the age of the victim, had a opportunity to weigh in and veto the disclosure. A policy like that would allow the spirit of what this victim's family wants to accomplish and still provide for what public disclosure should be used to accomplish.
Yeah, well, actually, even in the new law, there are exemptions, much like the ones you just laid out. So I think that already kind of exists in the current law. But if you wanted to do a compromise, you could strengthen those or sort of create new guardrails around those. And I think that's kind of what Adam Eben is trying to get at. Like, let's stop this one particular documentary maker that's causing all of this problem. Let's stop that documentary maker for now, then send it to the FOIA Council, and cooler heads will prevail. And, hopefully they'll have a reasonable discussion about all of this.
Could be. But Michael, what else have you got for us?
One more thing before we go. The big lie. Senator Amanda Chase's effort to spend $70 million of your taxpayer money to conduct a, quote, full forensic audit of the 2020 election. That was a budget amendment that was denied. But it's worth noting, Thomas, the senators who voted for this $70 million full forensic audit. I'm going to repeat that number again. $70 million.
It's a big chunk of change.
Huge chunk of change here, especially considering how many voters are there in Virginia? Like 4 million or something? I mean, this is a crazy amount of money to spend. So this is Amanda Chase's budget amendment. She clearly voted for this. Listen to who else voted for this thing. Jen Kiggins voted for the $70 million audit. Mark Peake voted for the $70 million audit. Bryce Reeves voted for the $70 million audit. Now, here's another thing fascinating about this budget amendment vote on the Senate floor. So many Republicans took a walk, right? They went into the cloakroom or whatever, and they just didn't hit the button. Bill DeSteff, Siobhan Donovan, Travis Hackworth, Steve Newman, Mark Obenshain, Todd Pillion, Bill Stanley, Richard Stewart, Jill Vogel. None of those senators pressed the red button or the green button. They just didn't press a button at all, which is fascinating. Now, and as long as we're naming names, Thomas, it's probably worth pointing out the 6 Republican senators who were brave enough to say no to the big lie. John Cosgrove, Emmett Hanger, Ryan McDougall, Tommy Normand, Frank Ruff, and David Suderlein. So this discussion, of course, has happened in the wake of the 2020 election, and you have all of these people who are making these allegations about election integrity. And so now this is come to Virginia, and you've got Amanda Chase wanting to spend $70 million of taxpayer money for this forensic audit. It was denied, but it really is worth noting how these Republicans voted or failed to vote on this issue.
Yeah, what's interesting is the 9 Republicans who took a walk on this particular vote all represent very deep red Trump country. However, they are Republicans who are not firebrands, right? So they've been in longer than Trump has been a thing for the most part. And they, my guess would be, know that this is complete BS and are also afraid of their voters.
For some context here, the other recent example where you saw a large number of elected officials take a walk instead of voting on something was on the other side of the issue. This is when Democrats were in the crosshairs for a bill that was actually introduced by Delegate Adam Eben to repeal the right to work law. And lots of Democrats did not want to be on the record one way or the other. And so you saw a huge number of House Democrats take a walk instead of voting one way or the other on right to work. So there is precedent for this. And this is the kind of stuff that happens in Richmond when people don't want to be on the record for stuff. So, I mean, I think that's what's, coming back to the big lie, I think that's what these people, these 9 Senate Republicans didn't want to be on the record one way or the other. And you don't have to vote, of course. I mean,
actually,
you are elected to vote.
Actually, Michael, There is no abstention in Virginia government, so they do have to vote. What happens, though, is that it moves so quickly that sometimes people will have a strategically timed bathroom break so they can avoid, or coffee break or trip to the cloakroom, so they can avoid voting on a particular bill. Sometimes, and I've seen this done, when that member returns to the chamber, they will stop everything and re-vote so that person has to vote on the bill. So the only time they're allowed to abstain is when something is deemed to fall under Rule 69, and that's when the member voting has a direct financial stake and an interest in the policy one way or another that maybe would, maybe wouldn't potentially sway their vote. That is the only time that abstentions are allowed under the Virginia rules.
Well, maybe the prospect of having Amanda Chase stand up on the Senate floor and present a budget amendment really makes a lot of senators have to go to the bathroom like right away.
I can see why so many people would just need to take a break after that. And speaking of, I think we should take a break after that, because when we come back, we're going to be joined by Twitter legend Goad Gatsby. He'll explain why sitting through a committee hearing is way more interesting than it sounds. We'll be right back.
This is Delegate Glenn Davis, and you're listening to Pod Virginia with Michael Pope and Thomas Bowman.
And we're back on Pod Virginia. We're joined by a Twitter legend, the guy with the disco mustache, tweeter of extreme politics, host of the radio show Richmond Cryptoids. Goad Gatsby, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. This is what a pleasure to be here.
We are actually doing this in person in the Pocahontas press room, which I have to say I have not done an in-person podcast like this since before the pandemic. So this is a rare treat for me. Thanks for joining us, Goad Gatsby. Now, you play a rarefied role in the General Assembly press corps, live tweeting these committee hearings with, I have to say, unyielding patience. Why do you spend so much time in these committee meetings?
Well, spending a long amount of time is really the key in understanding how government works. A good friend of mine, socialist dog mom, Molly Conger, also a real Twitter legend, she has dedicated herself going through the entirety of Charlottesville, City Hall, school board, civilian review boards, real estate boards. She goes through it all, and it's boring and it feels like a curse. But if you're able to figure out how this all works together, how it connects, you can paint this picture of how the entire government works. So having that type of patience is very important. And also, I may just have some type of disorder that lets me just sit around for a while and I don't know what happened. But that's also why, I was able to save up a bunch of money during the pandemic. A lot of people don't know this, but I had been working full-time in a restaurant while also following a large amount of protests. So I'm just able to take some time off from work for a few months and follow the legislative session, and I'm just going to be very thorough in doing so.
You are very thorough. Anyone that follows you on Twitter will know this. And we will get to the BLM protest later. I want to start, though, with your Twitter bio. It says you're a tweeter of extreme politics. What's the latest in extreme politics for 2022?
For extreme politics, it's been usurping this idea of the trucker convoy to try to have this big, obscene, supposedly like larger than life protests, but in reality, it's, at least in the US, it's less than 100 people, but it's consuming a large amount of attention in national media in terms of, this sort of extreme right. And there's no cohesive thought. Like, it's not just about like vaccine mandates, it's combined in a total cultural war that also includes connections to Proud Boys, being opposed to trans rights for some reason, being opposed to critical race theory. Like all of these kind of tie in together and makes one unified far-right ideology and a movement.
So this year, you have described the Republicans as moving the Overton window. What does that mean, and why do you say that?
So the Overton window, I don't remember who came up with that term. Maybe it was the Duke of Overton, but it's the idea that there is a window that itself can shift. It can be more wide open, it can be closed, and that's what can go through and what is an acceptable thought. So 2 years ago, the discussion wasn't about critical race theory. If you asked anybody about critical race theory, if it was being taught in schools, they would say, I don't care, but it sounds pretty good. Maybe they should teach it. But after, all this long time talking about how awful critical race theory is, it's now moved to, well, we don't even teach it. Not that critical race theory is good or bad. It's like you're now seeding whether or not it's a good thing to discuss. And so you're now saying like, well, I don't do it. So you've now set yourself up in a position for them to invent what critical race theory is and throw it at you and say that you're teaching that. That's how the Overton window has shifted.
On the issue of critical race theory, we on this podcast have repeatedly pointed out this is not taught in Virginia schools. And we got a 1-star review on Apple Podcasts from a listener who said that our repeatedly pointing that out means that we could not be taken seriously. Goad Gatsby, why are people so wanting to believe things that are just not true?
Have you ever heard what a political arsonist is?
No, I have not.
That is somebody who goes around and starts fires, political fires, not real ones, metaphorical ones. And it sets you in a position where you have to keep extinguishing these fires. So they have every incentive to keep starting these fires. So knowing what they're saying is false, they're causing you to react and put things out. So you're spending your time putting out fires. They're spending their time setting more fires. You can't do anything because you're up to your neck in fires. Meanwhile, there's other people that see all of this, and they're just looking for something that already agrees with their worldview, that conforms to how they see the world, and they have no desire to find anything beyond that. So these people like James Lindsay, who've made a career for themselves selling this anti-CRT movement, are really selling a worldview for somebody that agrees with them already, that says it's not your fault, it's somebody else's fault. And it allows people to escape this sort of inward perspective.
So we talked about political arsonists. Let's talk about medical arsonists. This General Assembly session, we've seen lots of discussion about using ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine as ways to treat COVID. You have been in many of these committee hearings. What were those hearings like?
So I've been around a lot of people best described as anti-vaxxers, but there's a combination of two feelings. There's people who are very angry at the world, that things have changed, that they're actually suffering the consequences of being anti-vaccine by seeing the people around them get hurt and suffer because they've refused to take these medical precautions. And so they're eager to blame something because they refuse to accept that their worldview is wrong. So it must be this hospital that's not prescribing me ivermectin. It must be these politicians who have come up with this type of system that says I can't have ivermectin. It must be these pharmaceutical companies who want me to get this vaccine and not ivermectin. And yeah, it's anger, but it's also sorrow. And it's something where they're unwilling to accept how the world is not how they see it.
When you're in these committee meetings, how do you come to make a decision on what you're going to tweet and not tweet? I've seen you, of course, tweet votes, but then also about Luis Lucas's purse game, for example. What strikes your attention in terms of putting stuff on Twitter?
By the way, purse game, the Luis Lucas, I think you're thinking of Amanda Chase. And it was...
I'm pretty sure you tweeted about Luis Lucas's purse game.
Oh man, I'm going to have to go back and research. I'll believe you at this point. But sometimes I don't want to I don't want to directly say what's going on, and I just kind of hint at it. And so with purses, it started with Amanda Chase because she would begin to suggest that she had a gun in her purse. And so I began talking about other people's purses. And I'm not saying Amanda Chase is walking in with her gun because I don't know what's in that purse. But I know that bag is a bag you can buy at Green Top that's designed for holding guns. And it's also a very tacky American flag style bag. So I don't think Senator Lucas is concealed carrying in her purse. I want to make that clear. But sometimes like there is sort of like this visual event that a politician is having. The one thing that's been really making me scratch my head is freshman delegate Marie Marsh, who wears last week she was wearing a bedazzled cowboy hat. You know, there's an intentional design that people are exuding from their clothing that I think should be noted in this, is that in the same way, if you're wearing a shirt that says "I'm for trans rights," you know, you would bring attention to that.
Said the man who has matched his yellow shoes with his yellow shirt and his yellow tie. And hot dog socks. Very nice. So you came to a lot of people's attention during the BLM protests, which must have been a whirlwind experience. What was all that like?
So I had, I'm a good marcher. I like to walk around and follow protests. And this was the time where I had decided that I wasn't going to be an organizer. I wasn't going to sit around and tell people what to do. I was just going to observe and talk about what people had been doing as it happens, and focus on police violence, because I felt like that was the key issue of why the protests started, is because there was rampant out of control police violence directed at communities of color and also protesters of police violence. And as this kept going, I kept seeing more police violence directed at protesters. And I wanted to do two things. I wanted to highlight how positive those events are, of the people that come out and the messages they like to send out to each other. But I also wanted to have a big emphasis on what the police were doing, because a lot of local media, and you know, there's a million examples of this, are eager to carry the press release that the police put out immediately. And you know, and this is a thing of police put out a press release, news stories also release that, and it's a matter of trying to get your story out really fast. But because I'm out on the ground and I can see things happen before the police have their press release, I already have something that would contradict the police press release as it's being released. And so there was one day the police declared an unlawful assembly, said that everybody left without police using force. And at that point, I had already collected a less lethal projectile rubber round, 35 millimeter rubber round that was fired in my direction. And the state police had already said that they hadn't used force, and I had already collected evidence of them using force. I already had seen them with their weapons out, and it is, you know, there needs to be some type of level of accountability, and I wish that there were other news sources that were able to copy me. I would find that very flattering, that someone would be able to see what I'm doing and replicate that, because I think that is an important way to adapt to how media is working, is that there's a much more rapid way of being able to confirm things as they happen.
So I have to ask you about your radio show, Richmond Cryptoids. This is a terrestrial radio show once a week, live on the air from 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. Goad Gatsby, what's up with broadcasting during the witching hour?
Well, that is when the veil between the other side is the thinnest. So if you want to get through to the supernatural forces, that would be the ideal time. I also find it a time where I'm not going to be busy doing anything else. There's not gonna be another march going on a Wednesday at that hour. But I stayed up until 3:30 a.m. because of my radio show last night. I had a wonderful guest, Ray Pickett from Planned Parenthood came in. But then I had to get up at 6:30, get dressed, get in the committee room for health and education. So, you know, I'm working off of 3 hours of sleep today. It's no big deal. But, you know, and I was rewarded because it was a packed room. I had to get in there early. And lo and behold, Governor Youngkin walks in out of the blue. So you just never know what's going to go on.
One last question before we let you go. Goad Gatsby, is that your real name?
It's half my real name. And I'm you're doing these in-person things, and I can go over and I can look at your notes here, and you misspelled my name. So I'm calling.
This is not for public consumption.
You've made a huge mistake here. Yes, my name is Goad, but my first name is something different, and Gatsby is not my name. And if you want to follow me on Twitter at Goad Gatsby, that's Gatsby Gatsby, you will see that my name is Christopher Goad, and you will see that there was a federal lawsuit filed against me where I'm described as having a disco mustache. So that's where the term disco mustache comes from. It's when I was attacked in Charlottesville by neo-Nazi Christopher Cantwell, and after filing charges against him from a magistrate, that he then decided to sue me for false arrest. And, having to hire lawyers and go through the civil process is quite annoying. But I like to keep that civil complaint, right in my heart to remind me of who's out to get me and why and what they say about me. And sometimes it's funny.
All right, well, the silver lining of doing this virtually is that people can't see my screwy notes where I misspell things, so thanks for pointing that out.
You're just rusty.
We have been joined by the Twitter legend, the guy who owns the disco mustache, the tweeter of extreme politics, the host of the radio show Richmond Cryptoids, Goad Gatsby. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, or whatever type of phrase you say when someone thanks you.
From Steve Artley Studios.
Lincoln Reagan party of two. Lincoln Reagan party two. Lincoln Reagan party.
Here. We're over here.
Lincoln Reagan party here.
Yes, we're here. Yes.
Right this way. Welcome to the Grand Old Party Commissary. Your server will be with you in just a moment. Well, Abe, it's been a long time since I've been here.
Oh, a lot longer for me, Ron.
It's nice to be back. Gee, it looks just the same.
I don't know, Ron. There's something. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's something. Doesn't smell right.
Hello, my name's Tucker, and I'll be your server. I have the cart here with various fare we're offering today. First off is the braised big lye thigh and a Lindsey Graham cracker spine bone broth, finished with grievance glaze. Here's our mock electors bouillabaisse with gerrymander side salad topped with chopped voter restriction dressing. This is the anti-vax pasta with Fire Fauci dipping sauce. Next, we have the elephant trunk bisque with grilled pounded pince, smeared with spicy deviled trader eggs sprinkled with grated Nancy mace. And this is the raw Trump rump roast with kingmaker dumplings poured over a bed of wilted Kevin McCarthy chard. Next we have parboiled EPA flounder. It's the full carcass filleted and stuffed with old McConnell testicles then roasted at the stake. Then we have a What, this?
Yeah.
Oh, this is our most popular dish. It's offered every day here at the Republican Party Commissary. It's our specialty of the house, legitimate political discourse stew.
Oh, now hold on just a minute.
Now, Abe, take it easy.
No, I've had a belly full of this. Look, Tucker, I know public discourse stew. I've had public discourse stew many times in many varieties. Some bitter, some sweet, some bland, some salty, some so spicy it'd make the devil himself genuflect. But this putrescence is no way, shape, or form anything remotely resembling legitimate civil public discourse.
Well, would you like to try a sample of it, perhaps?
A sample? I don't need a sample. I can tell by the incredible reek and stench it's something shuffled up from the stable floor. That goes for the rest of this mephitis you've been serving up here today. Have y'all gone mad?
Well, I gotta say, I'm with Abe on this one, and let me just add that Donald Trump, take down your gall. Come on, Abe. Let's get the hell out of this place.
I need this like I need a hole in the head.
Pod Virginia is a production of Jackleg Media. Our producer is Arian Ballou. Our transcriptions are by Emily Cottrell, and our satirical spots are by Steve Hartley. Find us on Facebook or Twitter. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And hey, write a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. We'll be back next week with another episode of Pod Virginia.